The voice of the flight attendant rang out clearly, loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "I will ask you one last time, please move to the back of the plane or I will call security." Her words were sharp with a clear tone of disdain. Knock, the black woman, as calm as ever, lifted her head and spoke softly. "I already said I will not move." She spoke simply, her tone gentle as if comforting someone, but beneath it lay an undeniable strength. She was being insulted right in front of everyone, but no one could imagine what would happen next. When the woman they thought had no power stood up and revealed the truth about herself, it silenced everyone in the cabin. What they had thought was a weak woman with no influence suddenly became the center of attention as she asserted her power in a completely unexpected way. The plane reflected the afternoon sunlight, its sharp lines evoking luxury and promising an exciting journey. Inside the cabin, everything exuded opulence, from the soft leather seats to the sparkling gold accents, all creating the feeling of being in a different world, where each passenger felt like a king or queen. The passengers moved gracefully, each carrying an expensive suitcase, creating a glamorous and powerful scene. But amidst all this splendor, what truly made people stop and think was that moment. The moment when a woman who seemed to have no power was the one who led the entire space to change completely. 1:14, they were led to the sleek private jet waiting on the runway. Soon they settled into their seats. Some people were intently scrolling through electronic devices, while others enjoyed champagne thoughtfully served by the crew. Inside the cabin, soft music played from the speakers, creating a relaxing atmosphere. Among them was Naomi Williams, a calm and composed woman in her 30s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit with matching trousers. Naomi exuded an elegant beauty, understated and graceful. She moved with quiet confidence, not trying to attract attention, but every eye couldn't help but notice her. 1:54, Naomi Williams walked into the cabin, and her silent presence immediately captured attention. Every step she took was deliberate, her gaze briefly sweeping over every corner of the cabin before she made her way to her seat. This was not just a simple trip, but a journey to oversee her growing empire. Though no one on the flight knew who she was, she preferred it that way, at least for now. Lauren, the head flight attendant, stood near the entrance, her uniform immaculate, and the sharp lines of her face radiated authority. She greeted each passenger individually, offering warm smiles to some and cold indifference to others. She took pride in her work, always maintaining impeccable professionalism. Lauren observed each passenger with a sharp gaze, evaluating their every gesture and attitude, ensuring that no one could miss her presence. Though Lauren's exterior exuded seriousness, the warmth in her smile made those around her feel at ease, even though she always kept a certain distance from everyone. Naomi sat down in her seat, but her calm demeanor and aura could not be hidden. Though she didn't make a grand entrance, she created a powerful silence in this space. She didn't need to show anything, she simply existed with absolute confidence, carrying a stillness that everyone could feel. Her journey was not just a flight but part of a bigger story, a story of power, resilience, and how she had built her empire from the simplest, most understated things. As the plane began to take off, the cabin fell quiet, with only soft music echoing, and everyone felt as if they were part of a mysterious journey, unaware of what was unfolding. Meanwhile, Naomi, with her heart full of ambition and her decisive mind, began preparing for the important decisions that would unfold throughout the flight. Those around her hadn't realized it yet, but their lives were about to change, and Naomi was the one who would write the next chapters of this story. Her hands were threading the needles, her eyes focused on each stitch, paying no attention to her surroundings. Mr. Raymond, with his calm expression, gave a slight shrug as he looked at his newspaper, but his gaze briefly flickered with curiosity as he observed the atmosphere around him. Lauren, with her sharp eyes, glanced over them, offering a sweet smile and responding, "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to serve you again." Seeing Lauren's smile, Naomi quietly turned, immediately noticing the change in her attitude towards each passenger. Without saying a word, Naomi sensed the invisible discrimination between those Lauren treated warmly and those she met with coldness, even without any attempt to hide it. Naomi had become accustomed to such things throughout her career, but at that moment she felt no need to speak up. She knew that everything would fall into place. Lauren walked through the cabin, carrying out her duties calmly, but her eyes never stopped observing, examining every little detail to ensure everything was in order. She approached the Raymonds, gently asking, "Is there anything I can assist you with before takeoff, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond?" Mrs. Raymond gently shook her head, not taking her eyes off her work. Mr. Raymond simply smiled faintly, scanning the newspaper once again, not paying much attention to the offer. Other passengers began to settle into their seats, and life in the cabin continued like any other flight, but Naomi still sensed the difference, one she couldn't ignore. With her keen observation and sharp mind, Naomi realized that this flight would not just be an ordinary journey. It would be a place where everything would change, a place where the underlying dramas were unfolding unnoticed, and where her choices would reshape everything. Her hands clenched, her face cold, without a smile or any sign of interest. As she neared Naomi, she glanced down at the handbag neatly placed under the seat, and her gaze lingered for a moment, feeling an inexplicable discomfort. But Lauren said nothing, simply walking by without a greeting or any warmth. Naomi maintained her calm, paying no attention to Lauren's attitude. She could clearly sense the change in Lauren's behavior, but she understood that not every instance of discrimination required a reaction. She also knew that people like Lauren always had a certain way of perceiving those around them, and in her eyes, Naomi probably didn't deserve to be treated like the worthy passengers. Lauren Reed, a woman in her 40s, seemed to live and work by one guiding principle: control. From the perfect uniform to the meticulously styled hair, everything reflected a woman who was highly perfectionistic and cold. For her, everything had to be proper to standard with no room for deviation. Naomi, on the other hand, was completely different. She didn't follow the rules Lauren had set. She didn't need to stand out or attract attention, and that was exactly why Naomi made Lauren uncomfortable. Naomi didn't let Lauren's coldness affect her mood. She continued her work, maintaining her confidence and calm, even though Lauren's treatment might not have been the first time she had encountered such behavior. But Naomi understood that, in life, sometimes you have to learn to accept differences and not let quick judgments shake you. Lauren stepped over and saw everything happening. She signaled to Grace to come closer, her voice as cold as ice. "Call security immediately. We can't let this passenger disrupt the order on this flight." Grace, a newcomer, hesitated for a moment before glancing at Naomi again. She could feel the tension in the air but also saw the firmness of this woman. Naomi showed no signs of panic or fear, only standing her ground. "All right, I'll call security," Grace said, but her gaze couldn't hide the doubt she had about this situation. Naomi continued to remain silent, her gaze as calm as a still lake, unshaken by Lauren's provocations. She understood that maintaining composure was her greatest strength. A few passengers began to pay more attention, whispers filled the cabin. Some felt uneasy with Lauren's disrespectful treatment of Naomi, while others secretly speculated that Naomi might be a fake passenger or was just trying to bend the rules to get an upgraded seat. Lauren stood still, looking at Naomi with a gaze full of contempt, but Naomi didn't look back at her. She simply directed her eyes out the window, as if everything around her no longer mattered. She gave a small smile, showing nothing but calmness. When security was called, the tension in the cabin grew, and everyone waited to see if Naomi would be kicked out of her seat. But what no one expected was that when two security personnel arrived, they did not ask Naomi to leave. Instead, one of them looked at the passenger list and greeted her with respect. "Excuse me, ma'am, sorry for the misunderstanding. This seat is yours, please continue with your journey," the security officer said, leaving Lauren stunned and unable to believe her eyes. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. The passengers around began to look at Naomi differently, at the calm yet strong woman who had not let Lauren's discrimination or provocations shake her stance. Naomi's eyes remained calm as she looked at Lauren, without a hint of fear. "I've already told you I'm not moving," she replied softly but firmly, with no sign of wavering. She didn't need to explain further, but Naomi's voice was like a cold stream that made Lauren feel suffocated. The passengers around started murmuring, looking at each other in surprise. Some saw Lauren's disrespect towards Naomi as blatantly unacceptable, while others felt confused, unsure whether they should speak up. A few, though not speaking, had changed their gaze. They no longer believed in Lauren's perfect exterior. Grace stood still, seemingly wanting to resist but didn't dare to. She couldn't understand why Lauren was acting this way, but Lauren's sharp gaze left her no choice but to slowly move toward Naomi. "We don't have time to continue this," Lauren continued, her voice now lacking patience, replaced by clear frustration. "You need to leave right now." But Naomi only smiled faintly, her gaze still cold, as if she were too accustomed to these situations. "Don't rush to a decision, I think you should double-check who truly belongs here," she said gently, her words now no longer a warning but a firm assertion. Lauren stared at Naomi for a long moment, the tension blurring her once confident demeanor. She couldn't understand how a woman like Naomi could remain so calm in this situation, and why Naomi could hold power simply through patience and stillness. Naomi kept her gaze steady without a hint of wavering. You shouldn't judge others by their appearance, she said gently, but her voice rang out like a warning, a soft reminder of respect. Lauren gave a mocking smile, her eyes showing no signs of empathy. And you shouldn't sit in a seat you haven't paid for, she retorted, her voice sharp as she tried to regain control of the situation. Naomi didn't change her expression. She simply picked up her phone, quickly typed a few lines, then placed it back on the armrest. She wasn't rushing, nor did she seem worried. You're making a mistake, Naomi said briefly, but her words carried a strange weight, as though she were warning of something about to happen. Lauren completely ignored it, only giving a half smile and quietly saying, "We'll see soon enough," signaling for Grace to continue with her actions. Grace, the service assistant, seemed to feel the tension in the air as she hesitantly approached Naomi. Each of her steps seemed to stretch the tension further. But Naomi remained seated, calm as if nothing was happening. She wasn't rushing, nor was she worried, and Naomi's calmness only made Lauren more confused. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath when Lauren raised her voice. "I will ask one last time. Move to the back of the plane or I will call security." Her voice was harsh, sharp, and there was an evident disdain in her words. Everyone in the cabin listened, none daring to move. This scene had caught the attention of many passengers. They observed Naomi. Those who had once thought she was just a regular passenger now felt there was something different about the unusual calmness she displayed. Naomi, still calm as usual, looked up at Lauren and simply said, "I've already told you I'm not moving." Her voice was gentle, almost comforting, but carried a distinct strength that made Lauren even angrier. A woman sitting in front, a lady who prided herself on her perfect hairstyle and air of aristocracy, leaned toward her companion and whispered in a voice loud enough for those around to hear, "It seems like she's trying to sneak in for a free ride." Lauren seized that comment as an opportunity, returning a mocking smile. "Yes, that's exactly it," she said, folding her arms and turning to the passengers as if calling for their agreement. "We have rules for a reason and some people don't respect them." Naomi didn't respond to the insults or the murmurs echoing around her. Instead, she kept her steady gaze on Lauren, her calmness unmistakably clear, like a silent protest far stronger than any words. Grace stood still, hesitating, then moved toward the passenger list clipped near the cockpit door. Her hand trembled slightly as she scanned the names, hoping to find something that could help Naomi, but before she could say anything Lauren snapped, "Grace, what are you doing?" Grace turned, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just checking," she said. Lauren cut her off, her voice sharp as a knife. "You don't need to intervene." Grace stepped back, her face flushed with embarrassment. She bit her lip, torn between doing the right thing and the fear of losing her job. As the tension continued to rise, a well-dressed man sitting across the aisle leaned forward. The man in the neat suit exuded composure, smiling at Naomi. "Sorry," he said gently, "is everything okay?" Naomi turned to look at him, her expression softening. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her tone calm but full of gratitude for this small but meaningful gesture. Before the man could say anything further, Lauren interrupted, her voice laced with criticism. "I'd be very grateful if you didn't encourage this disturbance." She turned back, pointing at Naomi, and said, "She's the one causing trouble." The man frowned and calmly replied, "From where I'm sitting, it's you who's causing the trouble." Lauren's face flushed with anger and she turned back, her gaze fixated on Naomi. "I've had enough," she snapped. "Either you move or I'll call security to have you removed from the plane," Lauren said, her voice sharp and filled with fury. Naomi looked directly at her, never blinking. "You can try," Naomi replied, her voice gentle but unwavering. Lauren's anger began to rise, her voice trembling as she moved closer to Naomi. "Why don't you admit that you're sitting in the wrong seat and stop wasting everyone's time?" Naomi remained silent, her calmness only fueling Lauren's anger. After a tense moment, Lauren finally walked away, leaving Naomi behind and returning to her duties. She hurriedly moved down the aisle, her shiny shoes making a soft sound on the carpet as she carried a tray of sparkling water. Though her demeanor remained professional, the tension in her face clearly showed her frustration. Naomi sat quietly in her seat, focusing on the book in her hands, her composure unchanged. The passengers whispered softly, the atmosphere remained peaceful until Lauren's underlying hostility began to surface. Naomi patiently waited for a drink, watching as Lauren served Mr. and Mrs. Raymond first, followed by other passengers at the back of the plane. However, Lauren didn't pay any attention to Naomi. When the drink tray was nearly empty, Naomi finally spoke up, her voice gentle. "Excuse me, may I have some water?" 1323. Lauren stopped, casting a contemptuous glance at Naomi. "I'll come to you when I can," she said curtly, then walked away without saying another word. Naomi's calm gaze followed Lauren's fading figure, but she remained silent. If you witnessed such behavior, what would you do? Would you intervene or stay silent? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Time passed, and Naomi shifted in her seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. She extended one leg into the aisle, the movement gentle and discreet. Lauren turned back, holding the tray of drinks, her sharp eyes catching the small adjustment Naomi had made. Instead of asking Naomi to move her leg, Lauren intentionally changed her direction. In that moment, Lauren's leg collided with Naomi's, causing the tray to tilt, spilling water onto Naomi's lap and the floor. Lauren let out a dramatic cry, her voice sharp. "Where are you putting your legs? You're causing a disturbance." The passengers turned their heads, surprised by the sudden commotion. Naomi looked up, surprised but still maintaining her calm demeanor. She gently wiped the water off her pants and spoke calmly, "But you walked into my leg." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering and resolute. "I only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else," she said. "If that's an unreasonable request, then perhaps you're the one who doesn't belong here." Her words echoed in the air, a silent yet powerful warning. Lauren's face turned red with anger. She moved closer, her fury bubbling up inside. "Do you think you can talk to me like that?" Lauren hissed. Then, in a shocking moment, unable to control herself any longer, Lauren raised her hand and slapped Naomi across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the cabin, sharp and shocking like thunder. Gasps spread among the passengers. The businessman stood halfway up, his face showing clear confusion and anger. Grace raised her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Even the curious woman from earlier was stunned, her mocking smile replaced by worry. Naomi slowly sat up straight, her hand calmly resting on her thigh, her face unchanged, her gaze still steady as she looked at Lauren. The cabin was silent, the tension palpable, almost suffocating. Naomi sat up straight in her seat, her face unchanged, but her eyes carried a weight that made Lauren hesitate for the first time. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life," Naomi said softly, her voice calm but sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Naomi looked at Lauren, her voice still firm and calm. "I've been patient with you, but your behavior has crossed the line." Naomi spoke, each word sure and strong. Lauren's face darkened, her jaw clenched, and her hands balled up at her sides. "You've crossed the line," she yelled, her voice rising. "You've been the one causing trouble since we boarded this plane." Naomi was not afraid, she didn't touch her face or retaliate in kind. Instead, she slowly sat up straighter, her eyes locking onto Lauren's, her calmness unwavering, even in the face of blatant hostility. "You will surely regret this," Naomi said softly, her voice full of authority, echoing through the cabin. Lauren hesitated for a moment, her confidence shaken by Naomi's unshakable calm, but she quickly regained composure and sneered. "Regret?" she mocked. "What will you do, call the police?" Naomi didn't answer, she didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes, and the passengers could feel the change in the atmosphere. From a corner of the cabin, Grace, the younger flight attendant, watched the scene with a mix of horror and determination. She had quietly observed Lauren's behavior throughout the day, and her discomfort was growing with each passing moment. Now she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Stepping discreetly away from the noisy area, Grace pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed, her hand trembling slightly as the call connected. Her voice was low but decisive. "This is Grace, we have a situation on the plane." Grace returned to her position, her face a mix of worry and determination. Lauren, unaware of the call, stood with her arms crossed, her anger bubbling up, but the power she once had was starting to fade. Naomi remained seated, her calmness a stark contrast to Lauren's fury. The passengers continued to watch, their gazes shifting from Naomi to Lauren, uncertain of what would happen next. One of them leaned toward Naomi, speaking in a low voice, "Are you okay?" Her concern was sincere. Naomi turned to her, offering a small reassuring smile. "I'm fine," she replied gently. The tension in the cabin was palpable, broken only by the sound of the plane's engines. Clearly the situation was far from over. Naomi remained seated, her posture steady, even as water still dripped onto her clothes. She looked at Lauren, noticing that her patience was nearly exhausted. The eyes around them quietly observed the situation, and the air in the cabin grew thick with tension. It seemed that everyone could feel that the situation had slipped beyond Lauren's control. While Naomi maintained her calm, a voice rang out from the back of the cabin. A member of the airline security team, called by Grace, appeared at the cabin door, immediately assessing the situation. With a quick glance at Naomi and Lauren, he understood the tension in the air. "She hasn't done anything wrong," he said to Lauren, his tone calm but firm. Lauren turned back with a flushed face, unable to hide her anger. She looked at the other passengers but found no support. She realized she was in a weak position, with no other choice but to concede. After a brief silence, Lauren swallowed, trying to maintain her composure. "We will continue the flight," she said, attempting to regain control. But in that moment, Naomi remained seated, her gaze unwavering. She knew that silence and patience had prevailed. The plane continued on its journey, but in the stillness, an important lesson about power, patience and fairness had been clearly delivered. Lauren, her voice calm yet firm, said, "All you needed to do was respect me, but you failed because of your prejudice, thinking I don't deserve to be here simply because of how you feel." Lauren's discomfort grew, her hand gripping the tray tightly as she approached Naomi, her tone mocking. "Maybe you should earn that respect first. People like you don't deserve my respect." The tension in the cabin became palpable, passengers exchanging glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain how to react. The unspoken question hung in the air: how far will this go? At this moment, Naomi's anger began to rise. "You shouldn't say that," Naomi said, her voice sharp but steady, her words carrying an unspoken weight that made all the passengers in the cabin wonder what would happen next. Lauren crossed her arms, her anger still smoldering. "Oh, come on," she sneered, "I've been patient with you long enough. Maybe now you'll understand that actions have consequences." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, her demeanor remaining unchanged. "You're right," she said gently, each word careful. "Actions do have consequences, and you're about to see what those consequences are." For a moment, Lauren hesitated. There was something in Naomi's voice that sent a shiver down her spine, but she quickly pushed that feeling aside. "I'm not afraid of your empty threats," Lauren said, waving her hand dismissively. "You're the one who will regret this." Lauren turned away, pretending to be confident, but deep down she began to feel anxious. She had crossed a line, and although she wouldn't admit it, she knew she was wrong. The gazes of the passengers, the look of fear on Grace's face, and Naomi's unwavering calm made Lauren feel uneasy. Lauren felt like the walls were closing in around her. She tried to push that feeling aside, but her thoughts kept racing. What if this woman isn't who I thought she was? The way Naomi behaved, the way she spoke with calm confidence, was unlike anything Lauren had imagined. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her anger. Lauren's anxiety grew as she replayed the moment in her mind. Why didn't she shout or resist? Why did she say I would regret it? Her stomach tightened as she realized that she had allowed her bias and anger to take control, and now, she could sense that trouble was looming. Lauren looked around the cabin, hoping to find support, but the passengers were no longer on her side. The businessman shot her a disapproving look, his arms crossed, silently judging. The curious woman whispered to her companion, shaking her head in disagreement. Grace looked as if she wanted to disappear, her hands trembling as she tightly gripped the passenger list. Meanwhile, Naomi remained seated, her face calm yet unreadable. She crossed her legs and leaned back in her chair, her quiet confidence making Lauren feel the anxiety spreading throughout her body. Naomi leaned back comfortably, showing no signs of fear or disappointment. All attention seemed to be focused on Lauren, and she felt as though she was being left behind in a situation she couldn't control. The tension only intensified as the gazes of the other passengers converged on her. "You can't just stand there forever," Lauren thought to herself, her anger rising once again. But just as she was about to speak, silence suddenly fell over the cabin, and Naomi stared at her, her gaze steady and unwavering. Lauren felt as if she was shrinking within her own space. Everything was no longer the same. The confidence and power she once had seemed to have vanished. What remained was only tension, and the sense of failure that was slowly rising within her. The sense of unease deepened with each passing moment. Naomi didn't need to raise her voice, nor act in an exaggerated way. Just by her silence she conveyed everything Lauren didn't want to hear. The atmosphere in the cabin grew even more tense as Lauren tried to regain control of the situation. But no matter what she said or did, Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that her actions would sooner or later come with consequences. Naomi's words echoed in her mind, "You are making a mistake." Little did anyone know that Naomi had sent a message, and her silent response to the slap was not submission but strategy. Trouble was slowly building up, and Lauren was about to realize the grave mistake she had made. What do you think Naomi will do next? Let us know in the comments. If you're following this story, be sure to hit the subscribe button. The tension in the cabin increased as Lauren paced back and forth near Naomi's seat, frustration rising. Naomi sat still, calm and composed as if the situation didn't affect her at all. But deep down, Lauren could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. Naomi didn't say a word, she just reached for her phone. Her movements were deliberate, quickly typing something and placing the phone on the armrest beside her. The gesture seemed simple, but it carried an invisible power that made Lauren watch it with unease. "What do you think you're doing?" Lauren asked sharply. Naomi didn't answer right away. Instead, she gently reclined her seat, her calm demeanor unchanged. "You'll find out soon enough," Naomi said softly, each word carrying weight that deepened Lauren's sense of unease. The cabin fell into uncomfortable silence, broken only by the steady hum of the airplane's engines. Passengers exchanged glances and whispered to one another. The curious woman leaned toward her companion, her voice barely audible. "What's going on? Is she someone important?" The businessman sitting opposite remained silent, his gaze seeming to imply he knew something. He tapped his fingers on the armrest, his eyes fixed on Naomi as though he had pieced together some missing pieces. No one else except Naomi had realized this. A few minutes later, footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin. The cockpit door opened and the pilot stepped out, his face pale and tense. He glanced briefly around the cabin, then made his way straight to Lauren, walking quickly and decisively. Lauren turned to face him, her frustration obvious. "What's going on?" she asked sharply. The pilot stopped in front of her, his posture tense. "You need to step aside," he said, his voice firm but with an underlying displeasure. Lauren furrowed her brow, confusion clearly showing on her face. "Excuse me," she replied, crossing her arms. "Why should I step aside? I'm handling this." The pilot's gaze flicked to Naomi, then back to Lauren. "I just received a call from management. The owner of this plane is on board and she is Miss Williams," he said clearly, his words striking like thunder through the air. The entire cabin erupted with gasps and murmurs. The curious woman gasped loudly, her eyes widening as she looked back and forth between Naomi and Lauren. "She owns this plane?" she whispered. Her voice carried disbelief. The businessman nodded calmly, his expression unchanged. "I had a feeling," he murmured as if this revelation confirmed what he had suspected for a long time. Grace stood near the airplane's kitchen area, frozen in place. A sense of relief was evident on her face as she realized that Naomi was not just an ordinary passenger. She was someone far more powerful than anyone had realized. Meanwhile, Lauren stared at the pilot, her face turning bright red. "That can't be true," she stammered, her voice losing its usual sharpness. "There must be a mistake." The atmosphere on the plane grew tense, the silence broken only by the hum of the engines. Passengers exchanged worried glances, the memory of the slap still fresh in their minds. Lauren stood near the aisle, her arms crossed, her defiance still evident despite the growing discomfort around her. Naomi remained seated, calm and composed, her demeanor unchanged. And then, without warning, the captain's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing ahead of schedule. Please remain seated and prepare for landing." The passengers whispered in confusion. The businessman leaned toward Naomi, asking quietly, "What's happening? Why are we landing?" Naomi didn't answer, her face still calm, though unreadable. Lauren furrowed her brow, her confidence seemingly beginning to waver as she glanced toward the front of the cabin with a look of concern. The plane landed smoothly and just minutes later, a sleek black SUV stopped right on the runway. The car door opened and two well-dressed assistants stepped out. Their movements were quick and purposeful as they ascended the airplane stairs with an air of authority, causing all eyes in the cabin to turn toward them. As soon as they entered the cabin, one of them spoke, "Miss Williams," with a warm and respectful voice. "Everything is ready for your review." A gasp ran through the cabin. Lauren stood frozen, her face pale, realizing the truth as it hit her like a wave. "Miss Williams," she stammered, her voice barely audible. The assistants paid no attention to her, their focus entirely on Naomi. "Do you need anything before we proceed?" one of them asked, their tone respectful. Naomi slowly stood up, her movements graceful and purposeful. She adjusted her coat, her calm demeanor radiating power. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady and authoritative. "I am Naomi Williams," she began, her gaze sweeping across the cabin. "I am the owner of this plane and I am also the owner of this airline." Lauren's mouth opened and closed but no words came out. The confident and arrogant flight attendant was now nothing more than a pale shadow of herself, her former self-assurance replaced by unmistakable fear. Naomi turned her attention to Lauren, her voice calm yet sharp as a blade. "Lauren, your attitude today is nothing short of shameful," she said, each word cutting through the silence like a knife. "You have disgraced yourself, mistreated a passenger, and tarnished the reputation of this airline." Lauren stammered, her voice trembling. I didn't know." Naomi raised her hand, signaling for her to be quiet. "You don't know because you haven't treated me with the respect that every passenger deserves," Naomi said, her voice firm. "Instead, you have judged, acted with prejudice, and exacerbated a situation that could have been resolved with just a little basic kindness." The passengers nodded in agreement. The silence that had previously existed was now replaced with murmurs of support. Their faces lit up with admiration. Mr. Raymond neatly folded his newspaper and nodded in approval towards Naomi. Naomi finally stood up, her movements slow and purposeful. She adjusted her coat and looked directly at Lauren, her gaze calm but full of authority. "There is no misunderstanding in your actions, Lauren," she said, her tone gentle yet imbued with a power that silenced the entire cabin. Lauren's eyes shifted around the room, her gaze sweeping across, looking for someone to stand with her, but no one spoke up in her defense. The passengers remained silent, watching intently, some surreptitiously pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Naomi took a step closer to Lauren, her voice steady. "While you were busy judging me," she began, "you overlooked your own duties. Your job is to treat every passenger with respect, no matter who they are or what you may think of them. And now there will be consequences." Lauren's hands clenched by her sides, her mind spinning. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words couldn't escape. She felt the pressure of everyone's gaze on her, and for the first time, her confidence completely shattered. Naomi signaled to the pilot. "I want this matter resolved immediately," she said, "and I want to ensure that this will never happen again to anyone." The pilot nodded, his face professional. "Understood, Miss Williams," he said. Lauren took a step back, her mind reeling with fear. She looked toward the exit, her instincts telling her to leave before things got worse. But before she could act, the pilot stepped in front of her. With a determined expression, he said, "You're not going anywhere." Naomi's gaze remained unshaken. "Lauren, your actions today have proven that you do not deserve your position. The decision is effective immediately. You are fired." Naomi's words were like a final verdict. Lauren's face contorted and she took a step back, her confidence completely crumbling. "Please, Miss Williams," she whispered, her voice faltering, "I didn't mean it." Naomi showed no sign of mercy. "You didn't mean to be caught," she said coldly. "But you did, and now you have to face the consequences." At that moment, two uniformed police officers stepped onto the plane, their appearance causing a stir among the passengers. Lauren's face turned pale as they approached. "Miss Williams," one of the officers said respectfully, "we've received your report. Would you like to press charges?" Naomi's gaze never left Lauren. "Yes," she said firmly, "this person attacked me in the presence of several witnesses. I want her to be held accountable." Lauren's mouth dropped open and she took a step back. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding," she cried, her voice filled with desperation. "I didn't mean to do that." One officer stepped forward, his tone serious. One of the police officers took out a pair of handcuffs. "Miss, you are under arrest for assault," the officer said. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Lauren gasped as she realized there was no way out. She glanced at Naomi, who still stood calm and composed, her presence completely in contrast to the image of Lauren, who was slowly crumbling. Trouble had arrived and Lauren knew she couldn't escape it. This was just the beginning of the punishment she would face. The passengers stared in silence as Lauren was handcuffed behind her back, tears streaming down her face as she tried to protest. "Please, Miss Williams, I'm sorry," she sobbed. Naomi's expression remained unchanged, still calm. "Your apology means nothing if there is no accountability," Naomi said gently. "You made a choice and now you must face the consequences." The passengers continued to remain silent, their eyes following Lauren as she stepped down the aisle. The once dominant flight attendant was now a defeated figure, her arrogance replaced by regret and humiliation. Naomi turned back to the cabin, her voice steady as she spoke to the passengers. "Everyone here, I apologize for what you had to witness today. This is not the standard of service I expect on my flights. From now on, we will ensure that every passenger is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." The cabin erupted in enthusiastic applause. Mr. Raymond clapped softly while Mrs. Raymond politely set her embroidered handkerchief aside to clap. Naomi turned to Grace, the young flight attendant, who had quietly supported her throughout the tense moments. "Grace," Naomi said, her voice gentler, "I noticed your professionalism today. Thank you for standing up when it was necessary. You will receive a promotion notice from my office." Grace's eyes widened and she nodded quickly, her face brightening with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Williams," she said softly. Naomi smiled briefly before heading toward the exit, her assistant following closely behind. The atmosphere on the plane had completely changed. The tension that once hung in the air was replaced by admiration and relief. Justice had been served, and Naomi had set an example that no one on the flight would forget. The passengers smiled at her, the warmth of the moment spreading throughout the cabin. The curious woman, who had been observing the entire event with wide-eyed astonishment, leaned forward in her seat. "Miss Williams, you are amazing," she exclaimed, admiration clear in her gaze. Naomi turned back to look at her, a gentle smile forming on her lips. "Thank you," she replied. "Remember this moment. Sometimes standing up for what's right is always worth it." As Naomi stepped off the plane, the fresh air of the runway greeted her. The black SUV was waiting, the driver standing beside it, holding the door open. Her assistants walked beside her, discussing her next meeting, but Naomi's thoughts were still lingering on the events of the day. Later, in a television interview, Naomi sat in a luxurious studio, her demeanor always resolute. The interviewer leaned toward her, clearly captivated. "Miss Williams, your story has spread rapidly, millions of people have witnessed how you handled this situation. What message would you like to send?" Naomi's gaze was steady as she answered, her voice clear and resolute. "Respect is a right, not a privilege," she said. "Everyone deserves respect, no matter how they look, where they come from, or what others think of them. True leadership is about setting that standard and ensuring it is maintained." The interviewer nodded, clearly moved. "So what would you say to those who have faced similar challenges but do not have the platform you do?" Naomi's expression softened. "I would say strength comes from within. Even when you feel invisible, remember that you have value. You don't need a title or wealth to demand respect. You just need to stand firm with who you are." A few weeks later, Naomi boarded another flight, this time welcomed by a different team of staff. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, and professional. The head flight attendant greeted her with a sincere smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Williams. It's an honor to serve you." Naomi returned the smile as she sat down. The atmosphere on the flight felt lighter, the service perfect, but more importantly, everything was filled with respect. She looked out the window, watching the runway fade into the sky. A sense of peace filled her. The events of that day had left a profound impact, not only on the passengers and crew who witnessed it but also on everyone who had followed the story. Naomi knew that her actions had turned an injustice into a lesson that would spread far beyond that single flight. She smiled, knowing that sometimes the strongest victories aren't the ones won, but the ones that inspire change. As the passengers settled into their seats, Naomi quietly took out her phone. After everything that had happened, she knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about changing a system that allowed prejudice and bias to persist. As the plane soared into the sky, Naomi leaned back in her seat, the window beside her offering a breathtaking view of the horizon, the world below gradually blending into a sea of blue and white. She gazed at the endless sky and once again, a sense of peace spread through her. This wasn't just about confronting prejudice or asserting her power, but about turning a moment of shame into a powerful lesson. A lesson that would spread far beyond this flight. Naomi smiled to herself, her reflection faintly visible in the window. She knew this was just the beginning. Every decision, every policy, and every leadership action she took was building a future where respect and kindness became the standard, not the exception. The airplane soared higher, the engines humming softly as it headed toward its destination, and Naomi, sitting in the leadership seat of her vision, felt a peaceful victory that no shock could shake. In a public statement released immediately after the flight, Naomi spoke directly to the world. Her words carried a message that resonated far beyond the boundaries of the airplane. "Luxury is not about appearance," she said in an emotional video that quickly went viral. "It's about the experience we create for others. True success is not measured by what you can afford, but by how you treat others." This statement sparked lively discussions on social media. People applauded Naomi's leadership and her commitment to change. Hashtags like #RespectAboveAll and #NowMissVision trended for several days, inspiring people to reflect on their own behaviors and biases.